everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Tim Russell, Vice President, Community Engagement and Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion for WTTW and WFMT, and welcome to today's Making Black America Through the Grapevine, a WTTW preview and community conversation. Making Black America Through the Grapevine, a new film by Professor Henry Louis Gates Jr., director Stacey L. Holman, and producer Shayla Harris. The four-part series recounts the establishment of the Prince Hall Masons in 1775 through the formation of all Black towns and business districts, historically Black colleges and universities, destinations for leisure, and the social media phenomenon of Black Twitter. With noted scholars, politicians, cultural leaders, and old friends, Dr. Gates discussed this world behind the color line and what it looks like today. The series takes viewers into an extraordinary world that showcases Black people's ability to collectively prosper, defy white supremacy, and define Blackness in ways that transformed America itself. Making Black America Through the Grapevine premieres on all WTTW platforms on 4 consecutive Tuesdays, beginning October 4th at 9 p.m. Now, before we get things going, I'd like to extend a very special thanks to the supporters of this project, who you can see listed here. Without the generous support of these national and local donors, sponsors, and WTTW members, Making Black America Through the Grapevine would not have been made possible. I would also like to give a special thanks to the DuSable Black History Museum and Education Center, the oldest independent Black History Museum in the country, for their partnership and support on today's event. Now, let's roll the trailer for Making Black America Through the Grapevine, and then welcome WTTW News and Chicago Tonight co-anchor Brandis Friedman, who will moderate this evening's conversation.
Watching the game of bid whistle is like going to the Apollo on amateur night. There is a magic to this game that makes it the Black national pastime.
Where'd that queen come from? I think they cheat.
Throughout our history, Black Americans have, with great ingenuity and imagination, created a world with its own values and rules. A world defined by unfettered racial self-expression. A world behind what W.E.B. Du Bois called the veil.
When we talk about networks of Black people, we're talking about different types of associations. There's a social type, fraternal, and intellectual organizations.
How were each of you shaped by Black social institutions?
I grew up in African preschool. I didn't learn Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. I learned Coal Black and the Seven Simbas.
What does Black joy mean to you?
Black joy means being in a safe space and feeling free, where you can really be yourself and shed that skin.
Wherever you have a large concentration of African Americans, you have business districts that rise up, that meet the needs in these communities.
Annie Malone and Madam C.J. Walker basically developed hair straightening. Was that a good thing for Black beauty?
Part of our magic is that we can do anything with our hair. I can straighten it, I'm still gonna be dope Julie, Black Julie.
Black social networks, Black institutions, they are like barrier islands. They protect us from the storms of this country.
When we come together, what time is it?
So what happens when we begin to see the deterioration of Black institutional life?
There have been people who've argued that our community was better off before integration.
When I was growing up, everybody in my sphere was Black. There was just that sense of everybody in this together. I think we've lost that.
When we look now in the 21st century, we see many of the same issues our Black foremothers and forefathers faced: economic disenfranchisement, anti-Black violence.
No justice, no peace.
But we're facing them without many of the institutions that Black people had to sustain them during the first round.
I constantly am thinking about what it means to occupy my identities. I do surround myself with Blackness.
As long as race counts in America, Black networks and institutions will always matter.
From the founding of the Prince Hall Masons to Black Twitter, African Americans have forged networks in their own image as the ultimate act of resistance and survival.
All right, I don't know about you, but just the trailer alone gave me the chills. If you have not had the chance to see this series of films, you'll get your chance next week. I highly recommend it. I am Brandis Friedman. As Tim Russell said a few minutes ago, I'm the co-anchor of Chicago Tonight here on WTTW News, and I'm really excited about the conversation that we are about to have because I have the honor of interviewing two dynamic women about the film for which you just saw the trailer. I want to bring them in so we can get the conversation going. Kim Dulaney is currently the Vice President of Education and Programs at the DuSable Black History Museum and Education Center here in Chicago, of course. She's also a culture critic and writer of children's books, poetry, fiction, and creative nonfiction. And her work has appeared in everything, including Rolling Stone, the New York Times, The Undefeated, Essence, and more. Kim, welcome and thanks for joining us. And Shayla Harris is the New York-based award-winning director and producer of Making Black America through the Grapevine. She's also produced and directed 2 episodes of The Black Church, This Is Our Story, This Is Our Song, along with, of course, Professor Henry Louis Gates. And she's also worked with Frontline PBS, the New York Times, just to name a few. Obviously, both of you are exceptional and expert at your work, so thank you for joining us. To those of you who are also joining us, I want to let you all know you are a part of the conversation, even though you're in a listen-only mode. Please, as you think of it, you've got questions, comments, jump into the chat and share them with us. I'll be sure to share them with our guests. Kim and Shayla, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Of course. So Shayla, let's start with you, please. Obviously, you've done a number of documentaries about Black history and the Black experience. Tell us about this one in particular. Why did you want to make it? And what is it about?
So this series gave me an opportunity to work again with the team that I worked with on the Black Church, Professor Gates and Stacey Holman, who was my co-director on that previous series and who also was a co-director on this series. And, you know, one of the great things about working with Dr. Gates, who, as most of you know, is this preeminent scholar in and around African-American history, is that this was a chance to talk about an aspect of African-American history that often gets kind of overlooked. You know, a lot of African-American history focuses on the struggle, focuses on these instances of overcoming racism, and this series was really about those spaces in between, what he called the sepia world, these spaces that have nurtured us and these organizations and these institutions that were sort of shelters in a time of storm where, you know, Black people created things for us, by us, and where Black people just lived, laughed, and loved. They weren't necessarily thinking about white people lamenting racism. They were just trying to exist in their full humanity, surrounded by people who understood where they're coming from. And as someone who loves telling history and loves lifting up hidden stories that aren't really known, this felt like a really incredible opportunity to share these stories with a really wide audience.
I appreciate that you describe this one as, you know, sort of about the stories in between, right? You know, it's not everything is about the struggle. Like, this is about just living their lives, you know, and all that comes along with it. Kim, as we heard in the trailer, you know, early on, the series references what W.E.B. Du Bois called the veil. Remind us what the veil is and what that means.
Oh, the veil, W.E.B. Du Bois talked about the veil in his book, Souls of Black Folks. That's where he kind of introduces that. And the veil is just the lens through which we, or a filter kind of through which we are able to see things, right? So it's always tainted. We can't just see clear view, untainted, without stereotypes or whatever else, other things that are kind of draped over us.
You know, as, you know, sort of a scholar yourself, what's your reaction to this film?
to this film series. I thought it was great. I expected to be bothered, but I
And you're not
wasn't.
just saying that because Shayla is here.
No, I'm not just because I really did, because I'm a critic. So I have to look for like, where are the gaps and the holes? That's what I do for a living. You know, that's what we do in academia. So I always tell people that's what we just do that for fun. That's what we do. And so I will say that I was pleasantly surprised. I saw varied voices. It touched on it had a lot of different people from a lot of different places, and it was just chock full of information, a lot of great information. And it was really beautifully woven together.
It's a fun way to learn. So for those of you who are joining us, you're lucky enough to get sort of a sneak peek, because this next clip is a bit of an extended one, the colored conventions movement. Let's play this clip and then we'll talk about it on the other side.
In 1829 in Cincinnati, there was a race riot that forced half or more than half of the Black community to flee.
It was a real attempt to literally wipe out the free Black presence in Ohio.
Ohio had never been a slave state, and it was considered part of the North. And so free Blacks heard about what had happened in Cincinnati, and they feared that it could possibly happen to them.
There's an attempt on the part of Black leaders to address the safety, the security of Black communities, and to think about what self-determination might look like in a place like the United States.
The Black Convention movement gets started in order to denounce what had happened in Cincinnati.
Reverend Richard Allen, in the last year of his life, bringing together delegates from a quarter of the states in the Union who met in Philadelphia at Mother Bethel Church for the first convention in 1830. A lot of the delegates are nominated by their own internal social networks. So we're talking about churches, literary groups, leading entrepreneurs, reverends, editors of newspapers, the leading writers, the lions of the 19th century from the Black community.
The colored convention movement is this remarkable network of state and local and even national conventions where Black Americans come from all over the country. This is the crucible in which Black Americans come together to debate ideas, the promotion of Black thought.
There is this debate that then happens. What should we do in response to white violence? Should we leave? Should we immigrate to Canada? Should we buy land? How are we to think about our relationship to the community of Black folk who are enslaved in the South?
One of the big debates within the colored conventions is one over the degree to which Black Americans want to be Americans and should aspire to be Americans at all. It would be a mistake to assume that everybody wants to be a U.S. citizen, because there are those who do not.
You had 2,000 African Americans leave Cincinnati and move to Canada. You even have people contemplating immigration to Liberia, back to Africa. But even immigrationists who argued that there was really no hope for Black equality within the United States continued the fight for the citizenship in this country.
So it's not so straightforward what it means to be an American. And I take the debates over what we call ourselves to be a reflection of a very astute ambivalence about what it might mean to be fully Americans in a nation that is capable of and guilty of a great deal that is pernicious for Black Americans.
The colored citizen is an American of African descent. Cannot a name be found that will explain these two facts? It is AfricanAmerican.
The term African-American is absurd. We shall be called citizens of the United States and Americans.
How unprofitable it is for us to spend our golden moments in long and solemn debate upon the questions whether we shall be called Africans, colored Americans, or Afro-Americans or blacks. The question should be, my friends, shall we arise and act like men and cast off this terrible yoke?
And I remember growing up and going to school, and folks were saying, you know, what identity are you? Are you Black? Are you African American? And I remember going home and asking my dad, like, what am I? And he's like, you're American. And I think it went back to like washing the dishes or something. So, you know, this idea of like, where do we fit in? Where do we belong?
Well, which box do you check? Are you Black? You know, even the census people are so intimidated. They go, you Black, African American, Negro, other?
Black.
You're Black?
Black.
Andre, what are you?
Same, Black.
Black?
Yeah.
Black.
Black? DeAndre?
I'm Black and I'm proud.
Well, I'm an African American. I like African American without a hyphen because I work both sides of the Atlantic. I write about Africa and I write about Black America, and I like that.
So I do think there's some power in naming the American piece, hence African American, the rich history of Blacks in this country and what they did, right, to abolish slavery, to work on eradicating discrimination. That Black history is often not taught, not celebrated, and I think to this day it's not.
So, you know, Nicole Hannah-Jones, she wrote in 1619 that, you know, Blacks, African Americans, whatever we call ourselves, and we're going to come back to that discussion in a second, but whatever we call ourselves are as American as it gets, because despite how this country has treated us, we continue to fight for making it better and for rights in this country. All of that said, I think we can all relate to that discussion near the end of the clip, though, about, you know, how you identify. Many of the panelists said that they identified as Black. Professor Gates says that he identifies as African American, and he gave his reasons why. But that seems like a long-running discussion, is it not? Yeah. Kimberly, let's start with you. Why do you think that's still an open question?
Well, I know for a fact it is. DuSable just renamed itself to the DuSable Black History Museum and Education Center. It was the DuSable African American Museum. So we just did a name change, and there was a lot of conversation about that before and after the name change. I should say I'm not responsible for it, but I understand it. So African American, some people said, well, how can you take Africa out? People, you know, because depending on what generation, kind of who your teacher was, where you get your understanding, how your identity was constructed, that kind of dictates what people call themselves, you know. And so some people want to see it one way and believe that it's very important to keep the term African front and center so that people understand that we're connected to this rich history. And then other people think of Black as being more broad to encompass all of who we are. Black people all across the diaspora, including the continent of Africa, are included in Black. So when people say Black, it's, for me, as you know, African American studies professor, scholar, for me, I'm both of them. You know, it doesn't bother me like that. Like I said, it depends on kind of when and where you enter, as that's what it seems to be to me. But the understanding of Black is that Black does include African American, and it also includes Haitian. It includes everybody. Black does.
Well, I think, Brandis, one of the things that I think that conversation and that debate kind of reflects, you know, something that we sort of kept coming back to in the series, is that African Americans as a whole have often seen themselves as a nation within a nation. You know, Du Bois even called African Americans at the time the small nation of people. And, you know, you see echoes of this colored convention even in the 70s with the National Black Political Convention that took place in Gary, where there are a lot of the same conversations about where do African Americans fit in political society? You know, should we be radical? Should we be conformist? Should we be running for office. And, at the time that the motto for that was "It's Nation Time." And, I think there are these echoes within our history and these persistent conversations about what is our role, and are the conversations and the Black thought that we're having in the sepia world, in these spaces behind the color line, how are they shaping and influencing American history? And you can see from, the color conventions to the Gary Convention that those conversations have pushed America in a lot of different directions.
And it seems like it's something that only communities of color have to consider.
That is very true and unfortunate.
Yeah.
Okay, go ahead. Sorry.
I find it interesting that you mentioned the Gary Convention, because while I was playing, I jotted that down because that's what that reminds you of, right? And so we always see that there is this connection in history. Nothing's new. It's kind of a connection, right? Also, when you all mentioned in the series about Liberia, 1820 is when the first group went back to Liberia. So that whole idea that I think the American part, even when I saw the woman say, well, I'm American, I'm like, because it's always, I am definitely, when you go to Africa, you see that you are American too, because the American frivol, all of this, everything that you experience and are raised with in America shows up when you go back to the continent, right? But to say only American, never that.
Insufficient to just say that.
Insufficient. Yeah.
Shayla, I wanted to ask you, because I liked the way you all told this story, and I liked sort of like the roundtable discussions that Professor Gates had with a different group of people in each part of the series. And some of those folks, we've seen before, we know who they are, and some we get to know over the course of the hour. How did you all arrive at storytelling that way?
So it was a little bit of a blessing and a curse to come up with that, because I think what's kind of hard to remember is that we did the bulk of our production in the midst of COVID, starting in 2020 and in 2021, before there were vaccines, before there were boosters, before anyone felt super comfortable gathering in large spaces, we had to produce this series. And so we were trying to figure out ways that made sense and worked with the story, but also sort of were platforms for us to connect with folks. And so we centered on this theme of using these Black spaces to help us illustrate these sort of roundtables. So we have a Black literary society, we have a rent party, we have a barbershop, we have a welcome table, to represent the themes of each hour and gather just folks around. And, what we kind of found was that it was so amazing for us all to be together, which was something that we didn't necessarily experience at that point in time. It felt really refreshing to be able to be in the same space with other people, and certainly having these kinds of conversations about what it means to be Black in America now, in the future. The participants themselves got to let down their hair and talk smack and drink and play bid whist and really celebrate each other and learn a lot about each other. And so I think it was a production sort of necessity, but it also kind of underscored a lot of the themes that we were certainly illustrating in the series, that these spaces are where people feel safe and people from all levels and generations can get together and have these conversations and share and care. And so it really, when I see it now, just seeing those cards land on the table really takes me back to that moment.
Yeah. So while we've got a second, I want to remind viewers again, please, you're welcome to drop your questions in the chat if you have them. We're going to play a couple more clips as we go along as well, but I just want folks to remember that we want to hear from you too. You're also a part of the discussion, so please feel free to chime right in. So you mentioned rent parties a couple of times, and I definitely want to get to that because rent party sounds like fun. So here's another look.
People say, Audrey, where are you from? I said, girl, I'm from Harlem. And this is what I say: born bred, toasted buttered, jelly jammed and honeyed in Harlem.
The Black Metropolis is this idea that you have a Black city within a larger city. So whether it's the Black church or Black businesses, social reform institutions, entertainment, a spectrum of institutions that caters to all the needs of the Black community.
When we think about Black life in northern urban centers, it was racism in a different form. It was a more impersonal form of housing segregation, second-class citizenship, labor inequality.
White New Yorkers fought to defend and control Harlem as an all-white neighborhood. And so they used various strategies, from taking folks to court to racial covenants and all these other things. And so what that did was it created all kinds of congestion, but it also created a Black population that could not move anywhere. And so you could also charge them all kinds of outrageous and exorbitant rents. And eventually the language would move from a Harlem Mecca to a ghetto.
When we're looking at the early 20th century, most African Americans were working class. They were not paid very well at all. They were barely able to sustain themselves and their families based on the money that they earned.
And so every month when the rent would come due, you had to find a way to pay the rent. And so Black people, we've been very, very good at coming up with creative solutions. And one of the solutions we came up with was to do these rent parties.
That was also the place where you could find individuals who could, help you find a job. They might tell you where to go to church. There was a sense of community.
If you're teaching a history of Black entrepreneurship, the rent party has such a special place. People get paid on Friday. Friday, the eagle flies, right? So you got to get them before they spend the money. So you have it on Saturday, right? And you send out these little invitations with a little rhyme on it. You're going to have a pianist, going to have Pig Feet, and then we're going to have Fats Waller on the piano. It brought everything together.
There was a psychological piece here. There was a piece of release. Mm-hmm. We're fighting every day to survive economically. Mm-hmm. We're being paid less and charging higher rent. Mm-hmm. And so I've got to find some place where I can pause for a few hours, meet some people, socialize, sweat a little bit, and leave all that at the door.
Because you're being kicked in the behind 5 days a week.
No question, at least 5.
Jason, tell us about the role of the pianist.
Yeah, the pianist is like the DJ. They're the gatherer. They're the ones who know all the songs. They're the ones who are monitoring the room, making sure everybody's having a good time. The rent party is also to get somebody through the month, Yeah. So somehow the piano is a collector in that way. But when the groove is really right, then you got to get out of your seat.
I think they even had some rent parties on Good Times, didn't they?
Yeah, they still have rent parties. Rent parties are forever. So that was a really fun, that was one of the first shoots that we did all together. And so it was really great to also have Jason Moran, who's just an incredible pianist there, to play some music for us and give us a sense of the energy and the jazz that was created in that moment. And so that was a really fun way of sort of looking at, what was this sort of innovation that needed to happen at that moment in time. This is the depths of the Great Depression, where people are suffering financially. And, I think a lot of times in African-American history, the moment between the Great Migration and the Civil Rights Movement just kind of gets yada, yada. Like people are just kind of like, it didn't
dot, and then.
Yeah, exactly. And so this moment is actually really a really flourishing period where a lot of things are happening culturally, politically, and socially. And so we wanted to look at economically how people banded together. The rent parties are like the precursor to Kickstarter and GoFundMe. People are leveraging other people's resources to help them get through the month, and, are innovating jazz music in these spaces. And, I think that was like a really awesome story that I didn't really know that much about. Like I had seen, like you said, rent parties on Good Times, but didn't really understand all this other backstory about redlining and, behind the color line. And so it was a really, really fun story.
I found it interesting. Like, so the rent party, a quick story. One, an Asian teacher was teaching it at Chicago State, right? A Japanese teacher was teaching it. And she got to that part, she was teaching African-American history, and she got it wrong. And the people were really upset in Chicago, because Chicago was known for that. You know, I say, think of it like, remember, and you see those scenes in The Color Purple and all these old movies where they have their own little shack club. So when we moved from the South to the North, we're in urban environments, but we still had to have our own club. We couldn't go to the other clubs at first. So the club is your house. It's simple. The club is your house, because you can't just go, you know, in the major club out there. We don't yet have our own clubs in those spaces sometimes, right? Sometimes. And then because we also have, you know, kind of class division a little bit amongst Black people. So the club is the house. I'm from the South Side of Chicago. We have basement parties all the time. Even when in my generation, you know, and then it's a quarter to get in, you got your DJ, you know? So this is a tradition. Again, you see that threaded through, right? It's just like going to the shack, like you all were saying in the piece, right? Going to the shack to relieve yourself, right? And be amongst other people and to find joy in the midst of whatever, right? So somebody got a house, that's the house where we having a rent party, and you're gonna get your rent paid. They also had little like gambling parties, right? And when you have Pekino parties or spades, like you have in the piece, you know, and when you put, you have somebody win the pot, but there's also a pot for the house, right? That the house gets for hosting. So it's very interesting, but it's very creative the way we survive and thrive and have fun doing it.
I love the opening of that clip and how proud Audrey Smaltz is to be from Harlem.
Right.
It was awesome. And it made me kind of think, you know, does that kind of pride, because later on in the clip, you know, we're talking about Harlem going from, you know, Harlem Mecca to the ghetto once it's, you know, once it's been changed, or once as it changes. And so it made me kind of think, you know, when I saw Miss Audrey, I'm kind of thinking, you know, does that kind of pride in where you're from still exist today?
I think it does. And I mean, I feel it myself. I was born and raised in Buffalo on the East Side, which is, you know, very much a Black world, also defined by these segregated borders in Buffalo. And I feel like I was nurtured by that Black world, by my family playing bid whist and running the streets until the streetlights came home with my cousins and all of that stuff. And so I think it is really indicative of these senses that these spaces are these like shelters in a time of storm, despite, you know, maybe being under-resourced or being, you know, left behind in some of these sort of traditional ways, but that the sort of sense of somebodiness that people get in those spaces, I think is hard to take away, you know, so.
I think I would agree with that 100%. I think the space when you're from these urban communities that have these rich legacies and their own identities, where Chicago is a place just by itself. So if you see a movie, Chicago is a character. The place is a character, right? And it's almost like a parent, like where you have your own identity, but it's a piece of your mama showing in you and a piece of your dad. It's a piece of Chicago showing in you. People will say, oh, you must be from Chicago.
Your Chicago showing, yeah.
So not only are you born to your parents, you're born to this other identity, which this space identity, which is Chicago, and it's real and it's palpable, you know, yeah.
Well, and Kim, you know, let's talk a little bit more about Chicago and its role in the making of Black America.
Absolutely.
Now, I know you can do this all day. I know you can tell me.
Yeah, I can do this all day. I'm going to bring a couple of things that were mentioned. Because when I think,
yeah,
when you talk about the making of Chicago, if I would have watched that thing and the making of Black America, if it wouldn't have had Chicago in it, that would have been real problematic for me. Right? Chicago is the seeding place for Black power. But in the piece you mentioned, I jotted here, the whole don't buy where you can't work. And that being started and brewing here. We know Adam Clayton Powell took it to a whole nother level, but it brewed here, right? And you mentioned Comiskey Park and the All-Star Game for the Negro League, right? How they rented that out. So those are a couple of spaces, because like a child, like I said, when it's part of your identity, you're looking for yourself in there, like what's in, because Chicago was such a major part in the making of Black America so I was very pleased to see those things.
And Shayla, what are some of the ways, obviously one of the pieces that you just mentioned, Kim, folks have to watch the whole thing, starts airing next Tuesday if they want to see the parts that we're talking about, that we're not playing the clip for. But Shayla, give us a sense of the ways in which we see Chicago in the series.
Yeah, one of the other really, really important places I think we see is, a figure like John H. Johnson, who is so synonymous with Chicago and starting the iconic Ebony and Jet publications, which I don't know about you, but like I grew up seeing those magazines on every relative's coffee table, bathroom, like beauty shop. And these publications were also very important to reflect Black beauty and to show representation in a publication where Black people didn't normally see themselves, and to center Black stories and center stories of Black accomplishment, not just Black travails or, struggles. And so John H. Johnson certainly is an iconic person from Chicago, and his empire is really rooted there. And so I certainly think that is a very, very representative Chicago story of entrepreneurship and innovation and very strong character.
All right, real quick, we do have
a textbook. Ebony magazine is almost like a textbook for people whose history isn't being told in those other textbooks,
Right. So we do have one viewer question, which means before we play the next clip, I want to ask that question and also remind our viewers, our guests who are joining us, that you're welcome to submit questions in the chat or the Q&A. This one comes from Juanita Creer. I do get paid to talk. Juanita Creer Price, thank you for the question. Do you see that the veil has cleared in color and you can see through? How long will it take for the veil to be lifted? That's a tough one.
That's a great question. I don't know if the veil will ever go away, just because I think just in any kind of society, there is a need to have someone who's other, someone who's not like the others. And so, whether Black people are behind the veil or some other, category of people are behind the veil, I think it will always exist in some way, shape, or form. And, I think one of the questions that we sort of had in the series was, once the veil or, the color line, as we sort of describe it, which was hardened under Jim Crow, kind of disappears, do you still need these Black institutions? Do you still need these Black spaces? Do you still need to, sort of find community with other people who look like you? And I think the answer that we kind of came across is that, yeah, you still need those spaces. Like I still have the group chat with my Black girlfriends to talk about all kinds of things to help me navigate life and to cheerlead for me and to be able to like put my hair down. So, I think the veil will always exist in some way, shape, or form, unfortunately.
Excellent answer. Okay. So I want to play another clip. This one's called, it's called Barrier Islands. And of course, we'll talk about it on the other side.
When we think about integration, we think about the gains that were made, but at what cost? At what cost to Black life? At what cost to Black institutions? At what cost to Black neighborhoods?
At the Weeksville Heritage Center in Brooklyn, I brought together 3 generations of political activists and cultural leaders for a candid conversation about the state of Black institutions following the Civil Rights Movement. Bayard Rustin said to Martin Luther King, the group of people who are going to benefit most dramatically from integration is the Black middle class.
We got some degree of integration, and there were some benefits from that, obviously, but I think it also made us realize some of the things we had lost. In terms of community, in terms of support, In terms of knowing the history, we lost something there.
I would also say that integration and equity aren't the same. Until we address the systems, until we address racial bias implicitly and explicitly, we can't even talk about the color line.
Segregation is still real. It is still happening around housing, around other things. And so Black people still find the need to find comfort, information, news, social networking in spaces and institutions that they've created.
Black social networks, Black institutions, Black civil society, they are like barrier islands. So I'm from the Gulf Coast, and those barrier islands break up the wind of the hurricanes, you know? These are the things that hold off the headwinds of the storms of this country. They protect us from those headwinds. So even though we get hit by them, we don't get hit by them full force.
And I appreciate Professor Gwad's analogy there because it's helpful to kind of understand his point. Kim, you know, we talk about history and community there and whether something was lost with integration. Did we lose anything?
Yeah, so first I want to point out that it's a difference in integration and desegregation. So what we have is desegregation. We don't have integration. We have very little integration because integration is like, I tell people about cultural diversity. When I taught that, people said, oh, well, it's different people in the room. No, cultural diversity is harmonious interaction with respect for those differences. That's a different thing than just having different people in the places, like just up against each other. We want to talk about fusing and respecting, right, those things. And so I don't think we yet have integration quite well because integration involves equity and things like that. But I will say, I always said that Brown v. Board in 1954 came too early. It came like when this country was still teenagers. And then it just said like, okay, you good, you grown, go be free. And you had wrecked them so horribly, such horrible leadership that people weren't yet ready. So you could change the laws, but you didn't change people's perceptions and their understanding. And then you just said, now go with them. And y'all just treat them right. It's like a fantasy. It's not real. And so a lot of things we see are just new iterations of the same old things. And that's what's hard. What's hard is that there's so many good people in the world, right, who really are trying to get it right, but don't recognize the seeding of the sickness, right? So it takes a lot to dig that out. It took a lot to concretize it. It just take a lot and a long time to make it real and make integration a real thing, fully, with full equity and all of that. So yeah, I think it came too early. And let me point out that wasn't what was desired at first. People weren't asking to go to school with white people. They were asking for equal resources. And then that got swapped into this whole go into those places. People know they weren't safe in those places. They weren't asking for that at first, but rather than give us resources, which would have gave us almost equal footing, people thought, well, let them come over here. Kind of, sort of, so that's what happened. That's what happened with that. And so, yeah, I don't think we achieved that yet.
Yeah. Shayla, is there anything you want to add?
No, I mean, I think Kim makes a lot of great points. And obviously, I think Eddie Gwad is brilliant. And I think his assessment of and metaphors, I think, are useful in sort of still thinking about how the African-American community is navigating even this moment. There is still white supremacy. There's still, aspects of desegregation or segregation or the color line that are inhibiting people from being able to live in their full flower. And so you do still see a desire to have these spaces for folks to go to HBCUs, to write and produce culture from a Black lens, whether that's from hip hop or writers like Toni Morrison, or to really state in a super obvious way that Black Lives Matter in the political context. So the fact that those things still need to be said shows how far we still need to go, I think.
Yeah. Okay. We're running almost out of time, but I want to get to this last clip, Black Resilience and Joy, and then we'll talk about that before we go.
Racism has been a fault line running straight through the American experience. Race has shaped where Black people could live, how they saw themselves, and what kind of future they could hope to achieve. But remarkably, Black people survived the strictures of racism by creating their own world, a sepia world, a nexus of formal and informal spaces by us and for us.
When we talk about Black social networks, what we're really talking about is how Black people create spaces where we can be seen and where we can be heard by each other.
They're a place to, celebrate. That often gets overlooked. When we talk about Black life, particularly in America, it's like, sometimes you just want to celebrate how dope it is to be Black. And that's important, particularly in a country that the best you can say is misunderstands Black people. And the most damning thing you can say is doesn't care about Black people.
Generation after generation, these organizations, institutions, and social networks have been a shelter in the storm, a place from which to demand that America confront its failures and finally live up to its ideals.
Folks are still going to HBCUs, thank God. Folks are still going to church, going to mosque. Folks are still organizing. Folks are still partying together. We're resilient folk. We're resilient folk. Even in our darkest hour, there are these eruptions of joy.
What does Black joy mean to you?
Black joy means being in a safe space and feeling free. Usually it's with other Black people where you feel like you can really be yourself. That's when you experience that joy. Without that joy, and I don't know how I would survive.
I think Black joy is our genetic coding that's like throw your hands in the air and wave them like you just don't care, that common hip hop. That's what joy is. It's like no matter what burden has been put on the people that have this darker skin, there has been a way to shake it off, rise up, and to celebrate, and that is joy.
Being Black in America is taxing. Let's start there. Being an activist in Black in America is extremely taxing. To be able to do this work, you cannot do that without being whole first. You cannot take on the world without first taking care of yourself. And so I think it's really important that when we see trauma, that we resist that trauma with joy.
For me, Black joy is community. That sense of community manifested in our social relationships, our culture, and our laughter. I mean, laughter is at the heart of it.
On Juneteenth, finally a federal holiday, joyful celebrations of the triumphs of the Black past and hopes for a victorious future are on full display. It's a time to reflect on the enduring legacies of our small nation of people.
So we played that clip, but that clip reminds me of a moment in the first part of the series where Professor Gates asks the panelists about Black love and what is Black love. And so I just wanted to bring that up again for folks who don't know what I'm talking about. You have to watch it. But it seems to me that, there's a question or a discussion to be had about both of these, right? What is Black love? What is Black joy and resilience? And coming off of that previous clip where, we're talking about losing our barrier islands, we also hear Professor Glaude name HBCUs and churches and mosques as examples of Black institutions that are still thriving. Shayla, are there other, what other modern day, institutions besides Black Twitter, would you say are still thriving?
I think they may take different form than sort of what we've seen in the past. They're maybe not brick and mortar, maybe they're more digital. Like I said, I think there's a lot of group chats out there. I think there's, Black Lives Matter is also this sort of umbrella organization. It's not, the NAACP that has a specific location. So I think it's varied in that way, which I think is in some ways beneficial to the society that we exist in right now, because Black people are in a lot of different spaces. We're not necessarily all existing in the same community. But I think there is also a way that these Black spaces are recreated in sort of small form. Like I just even think about this series itself, to me was a way of celebrating Black joy. Working with Dr. Gates, working with my co-director, who is a beautiful, talented Black woman who went to an HBCU. We had a Black female composer who's incredibly talented and brought her perspective to the series, and centering voices like Professor Glaude and Tiffany Gill and all these other brilliant Black scholars. So I think there's just other ways and forms that sort of sepia world or Black institutions or Black joy takes, and I'm super open to all of that in the ways that it just kind of isn't so codified that everybody can sort of define it for themselves.
Mm-hmm.
Kim,
I would add. So for me, Black joy is kind of like it's an unrestrained reflection of self. So I don't have to worry about holding part of it in, or what can I let out here? And so there are so many places now. One organization in Chicago here, we got African National House, they put on African Festival of the Arts, right? So in that space, you feel like you get a feeling a little bit like you're in Africa, right? We have a friend of mine, Dr. Greg Carr, they have Narrative, and they do In Class with Carr, which is a free online Black Studies class, the largest probably that exists, right? 40,000 people watch it each week. He and Karen Hunter started that during COVID, right? It's beautiful. You go into space, it's a safe space. People share things. Everybody brings something to contribute. So that's a new thing, but it's an old way. It's our old way. It's just like when we ran off to the, and taught school in the woods somewhere when we weren't supposed to be teaching. So it's old ways, but it's just new iterations where we're using technology to do those things. So that's what Black joy looks like to me. It looks like where I'm free to see and be myself.
So we're just about out of time. I'm going to give each of you sort of like a closing question. And Kim, I'll start with you. What as a critic and, an expert yourself, what is it that you want people to take away from this film, to learn from this film?
Well, I want people to know to watch it, first of all, to see that Shayla was talking earlier, and I was thinking the magic of this piece is that it's communal. So those moments when you had a group, that's African-centered. We don't believe in you, the head person who knows everything. That's not a good way for us. So even in the classroom, I'm just a guide. So to have all of those people sitting at the table and the pause, the telling, and the experts talking to hear from the people, that's communalism. That's at the core of African-centeredness. So I want people to watch it and feel included, because it was communal. The work was communal. It had all these different voices, and it let in other people that oftentimes don't get in on these type of productions. So that was greatly appreciated.
Shayla, same question to you. Obviously, this is your baby. You're sending it out to the world next week. What do you want folks to take from it?
Yeah, I think there's a couple things I want people to take from it. I want Black people to see this and see themselves and recognize their stories and their families and their histories that don't often get centered in stories about African-American history or even American history. But I also think that there's a way that, other communities can learn from this and understand that African Americans didn't just survive racism in this country. They thrived and actually transformed American culture. And so the secrets that are happening behind the color line are like the worst kept secret, because they have influenced and shaped culture, politics, economic, every aspect of American society. And so for me, I think this series is coming at a really important time where, history, there's a lot of contention about the history that's being taught in schools. And I think hopefully a series like this can start to fill in some of those gaps and give people some important context so that they can make some really productive decisions about the future.
Okay. We'll have to leave it there because we are fresh out of time. But Shayla Harris, producer and director of Making Black America Through the Grapevine, Kim Dulaney, vice president, DuSable Museum. Thank you both for joining us. We appreciate it so much. And for participating in today's Making Black America Through the Grapevine, WTTW preview and community conversation. Again, Making Black America Through the Grapevine premieres on WTTW platforms on 4 consecutive Tuesdays beginning October 4th. That's next Tuesday, because October's coming, at 9 p.m. And of course, I would love to encourage you to visit WTTW.com/events and WFMT.com/events for other upcoming events. And finally, please join me and my co-host, Paris Schutz, weeknights at 7 p.m. for Chicago Tonight, and me, Saturdays at 6:30 for Chicago Tonight, Black Voices. Until next time, take care, everyone. Thanks so much, and have a good night.